Tonight on Nation to Nation, it's been 3 years since Jody Wilson-Raybould was dumped from cabinet and the Liberal caucus over the SNC-Lavalin scandal, but she still stands firm in the convictions that led to her removal.
Insisting that politicians, the Prime Minister, Cabinet do the right thing is something that I won't apologize for.
Last week, the MMF left the Métis National Council because the national organization is letting non-Métis in as citizens, according to MMF President David Chartrand.
And now they're trying to do some beadwork, they're trying to do some kind of Red River jig on their own now, and they're trying to steal our identity and our culture. And in other parts of the world, they go to war for this.
I'm Brett Forster, and welcome to Nation to Nation. It's a brand new season of political goings-on across Canada, and we're kicking things off with a familiar face. Jody Wilson-Raybould's memoir is a cautionary tale about the pitfalls of power. It describes her whirlwind journey from one of Justin Trudeau's star ministers to one of his fiercest critics. From being Canada's first Indigenous Minister of Justice to feeling tokenized, marginalized, and forced out of government. Indian in the Cabinet is a critique of Ottawa's most corrosive qualities, but it's also a meditation on what needs to change. To talk about all this, Jody Wilson-Raybould joins me from Vancouver. Miss Wilson-Raybould, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So what motivated you to sit down and write a political memoir?
That's a good question. Lots of different motivations. I felt in reflecting on my time in government and as an MP and as, elected person in the Indigenous communities that it was important to share of my experience both in government and in various elected positions. And that's what I did over the last year.
And I think many will recognize your book's title as a reference to the 1995 film, The Indian in the Cupboard, but it also has undertones of tokenization and racism. So why did you choose that particular title?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think that the title is important and reflective of a lot of the experiences that I speak about in the book, particularly being the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. I went and ran as a member of Parliament as a proud Indigenous person, of which I, of course, still am, and realized that marginalization, both on gendered and racialized terms, can be experienced around any table. And my reflections about having colleagues see me simply as an Indian, as opposed to a proud Indigenous person with vast lived experience and expertise on the particular issues that I wanted to address while I was in Ottawa, Indigenous Reconciliation being among them.
On that particular note, your book criticizes the Liberal approach to Indigenous rights and describes some of your disagreements with Minister Carolyn Bennett about it. What do you take away from that experience as you look back on it now?
Well, I remain someone, along with so many of our Indigenous leaders across the country and people in communities, as someone committed to true reconciliation, to ensuring and upholding our rights and having our rights recognized and enabling us to be self-determining, self-governing within a stronger Canada. That's why I came to Ottawa and with the intent on doing and found that in my experience, and we can reflect on the 6 years of this government, that is something that's not necessarily the priority of this government. And what I mean by that is the transformative change that is required to change laws, policies, and practices to create the space for Indigenous nations to be self-determining. That didn't happen. I'm hopeful and know that we will continue to advocate for that reality. But, sometimes, and we've seen this, is that, symbolism is prioritized over substance and real action. And I talk a lot about that in the book and what needs to be done, what we know needs to be done, and the solutions that have been put forward by our leaders for generations that need to be implemented.
Yes, there was a number of interesting parts in your book. At one point, I noted how you described feeling gaslit by the PMO for urging them to act on Indigenous rights and not fall back into some of those old colonial patterns. Why did you decide to take that stand?
Well, I have been raised, one, and of course, to know who I am, to be proud of who I am and where I come from, and the reality that we need to speak up and that it's always the right time to do what is right. Transforming the space, outrunning the shadow of the colonial legacy for Indigenous peoples in this country should be a top priority, and it hasn't been a top priority in terms of all federal government. So shining light on that, insisting that politicians, the Prime Minister, Cabinet do the right thing is something that I won't apologize for, and certainly know that people will continue to advocate for the proper place of Indigenous peoples in this country.
You refused to become Indigenous Services Minister before being shuffled to Veterans Affairs in 2019, but you recommended Mark Miller for the job instead, and he didn't get it. Of course, he eventually was promoted a few months later. How would you rate his approach so far?
Well, I appreciate Minister Miller. He and I have had many conversations over the years. I certainly think that his heart is in the right place and that he is well intended. I don't take anything away from him. It's a difficult position to be in. For me, it was clear from the very beginning that that is not a place that I could serve, in that I was not willing, and I made this clear to the Prime Minister, to be the Indian agent to ministering to my own people. What I have always wanted to do and will continue to do is advocate for true reconciliation and moving beyond the Indian Act and enabling Indigenous peoples to be self-determining. I wish Minister Miller well. There are many things that need to be done, and I'm hopeful that he will stand up, listen to Indigenous peoples and the solutions that Indigenous leaders and communities have been putting forward, and do what is necessary to make the transformative change in this country. And that starts with changing laws, policies, and practices of the federal government.
Okay, we have to take a short break, but we'll have more from Jody Wilson-Raybould when we return. Welcome back. Still with me remotely via Zoom is Jody Wilson-Raybould, who opted not to run for re-election this year after sitting as an independent MP for 2 years. Ms. Wilson-Raybould, before the break, we talked about your new political memoir, Indian in the Cabinet. It describes your initial confidence in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's leadership, which slowly diminished over time. What are your thoughts about the recent federal election, a third straight victory for Trudeau?
Well, I like many people, watched the election unfold, and we find ourselves now after election day in a place that's very similar in terms of the makeup of Parliament to the Parliament before the election. Canadians saw fit to give Justin Trudeau a minority government, which I interpret as Canadians saying, and I think necessarily so, that parties, that the Prime Minister must work together. There must be cooperation across party lines to address the major issues facing our time. So we find ourselves in a place very similar to what we had before, but still facing the incredible challenges, whether it be on reconciliation, climate change, but also having, the divisive nature that we saw in the election still, be likely brought into this Parliament, and that's dangerous or corrosive to our democracy and what we need, which is to work together on these major issues.
Before the break, you talked about the need for transformative change. But what specifically should the government do? Repeal and replace the Indian Act? Is it constitutional reform or maybe something else?
Well, I mean, you mentioned constitutional reform. I think ultimately, at some point, we're going to need to look at the Constitution. I know many people don't want to reopen that, but they're not only in dealing with Indigenous self-government, but Quebec and other issues. I think that's ultimately going to be a conversation we have. But what I advocated for, and what so many Indigenous leaders advocated for and have been for years, is to have a comprehensive approach to the recognition of Indigenous people's rights. Yes, UNDRIP has been brought into Canadian law, but what that requires now and what has been advocated for is there needs to be changes in laws, including the Indian Act, which is a very racist piece of legislation that remains on the book, changes in laws, policies, and practices of government to enable Indigenous peoples to create the space for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, to be self-governing. There was a comprehensive plan that was put forward and advocated over years. The Prime Minister promised to have a rights recognition framework in place on February the 14th of 2018, and he has not fulfilled that promise. That's what needs to happen. It's been laid out, and Indigenous peoples have been advocating for dating back before the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples.
And how confident are you we'll see it happen? Is there some reason for optimism, or do recent events maybe suggest more of the same?
Well, recent events suggest that the patterns of this government, patterns that I talk about a lot in this book, still exist, and that's disheartening. But I hope that Indigenous peoples and beyond Indigenous peoples, that allies, that Canadians know that this is the right time. It's always the right time to do the right thing, and I'm hopeful that this government, supported by all members of Parliament, will do what was promised, as I said, on February the 14th, and properly recognize Indigenous people's rights, stop fighting Indigenous peoples in court, but actually create the space for real and true reconciliation in this country.
Another issue your book mentions briefly is the internal dysfunction you witnessed as an AFN regional chief, which you say to some extent continues to this day. Where does that organization need to go from here?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, I would say, I was extraordinarily pleased to see Roseanne Archibald become the first female national chief. She's put forward a platform or mandate entitled The Healing Path. There's a lot that goes into that in terms of ensuring that the recent revelations around residential schools and the unmarked graves need to be dealt with, and we need to be able to support Indigenous communities in the manner that they see fit. But also, the AFN, as it has been for years and years or forever, is an advocacy organization, and Indigenous communities, including my own community, want to move increasingly towards self-government and to have mechanisms to move beyond the Indian Act. A national chief and the executive have an enormous opportunity. I know that the national chief is working incredibly hard, and I, of course, support her and the executive will support them in any way that I can. But one of the major things that they will do, I'm sure, is to challenge, is to work with, is to ensure that this government does what they've promised to do. Back in 2015, on February 2018, and today, enough of excuses that it's too hard. We know what needs to be done as Indigenous peoples to create the proper place within this country for our nations to rebuild.
These last couple of years have been tumultuous for Indigenous people as the fight for rights continues. The country has been shaken by civil unrest, systemic racism, and, as you just mentioned, the discovery of unmarked graves. Are you worried this period in time could wind up being a missed opportunity?
Well, I tend to not think in terms of missed opportunity. I am buoyed by what I know. I'm in Vancouver right now. Is my neighbors, people across this city, and I know across the country, Canadians want governments to do the right thing when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And, when I was the regional chief so many years ago, things have changed since then. Canadians are pushing the agenda, and Canadians need to continue to lead our leaders along with Indigenous peoples to do what Section 35 of the Constitution speaks about, which is the recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. We need to ensure that Indigenous peoples, at their own pace and based on their own priorities, have the ability to be self-determining, which includes self-government. And that's what we're going to continue to advocate for, I know, from every corner of this country.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there for now. Ms. Wilson-Raybould, I want to thank you for being on Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
After the break, I speak with MMF President David Chartrand on what may be a watershed moment in Métis politics. Stay tuned. Welcome back. After decades in existence, the Métis National Council is no longer the same organization. Formed in 1983 to advocate on behalf of Métis federally, it went through some upheaval recently. On the eve of a court-ordered special assembly, the Manitoba Metis Federation left the organization. The council's long-term president, Clem Chartier, chose not to run again and was replaced by its first female president, Cassidy Caron. To talk about all this and more, we're joined by MMF President David Chartrand. Welcome.
Thank you, Brett.
You claim the Métis National Council had abandoned the MMF and not the other way around. How so?
Well, if you go back in history, and I thank you for the preamble, in 1983, MMF was one of the strongest governments formulating the Métis National Council. There was 3 of the founding members, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And the premise was really to always protect our identity, our identification of who we are as a people, our nation, and definitely the River Métis. And that's been an ongoing development. Of course, as you see in history, we've come a long way in this country. And to find ourselves at a crossroads again, throughout the last decade and so, Ontario has been really pushing against the definition, although it was adopted by everyone in 2002. All of us adopted a national definition.
Yes, okay. I want to thank you for reminding us of some of that background. But on the other hand, 4 of the 5 provincial Métis organizations appear to disagree with you. So aren't you and the MMF in a minority position on all this?
Well, not if you have the largest and the core of the Métis Nation, the River Métis. We are the core. We are the heartbeat of the Métis National Council. And we've made it very clear. We've been advocating strongly to all those are listening that the Métis Nation must be protected. It was Riel's view and his vision back in early 1970 that his biggest fear would be we'd be swamped from the outside, but his biggest fear would be we'd be swamped from the inside. And that's exactly what's happening now. And if you listen to Ontario, and I encourage people to listen to this, listen to Ontario, to President Fro, when she describes the Métis of Ontario. She describes 5 different people. She describes the Métis Nation, which is the historical nation of us, which is part of the western edge by Fort Francis this way, the western part of Ontario, small piece. And then she'll describe the Poly Métis, Section 35 right Métis, the Root Ancestry Métis, and the Voyager Métis. So there's 5 different Métis she's talking about there. They're not us. They're part of the Algonquin people, and I wish they would find their way back home where they should be part of the Algonquin nation. But clearly they decided they wanted a piece of what the Federation and the Métis Nation had been successful in the last decade or so achieving in this country. So it's very clear there's a Pan-Aboriginal organization in play now.
And given how long-standing some of these issues have been, is there anything President Caron can do at this point to heal the rift?
Well, I feel for her. She's a young lady, a student still at university, And she's got a hell of a challenge. She's got to promote now, because she said she speaks on behalf of all the Métis Nation. She does not speak on behalf of the MMF or the Red River Métis, which is, I said, we're the core and the heartbeat of the nation. And at the end of the day, she's got to somehow incorporate the ideology of those 5 different Métis in Ontario that she's got to bring in. Because she does recognize that they're part of the Métis Nation now in their adoption. And as an advocate, she's going to have a challenge of how does she get that going at the same time when she's going to take her direction from the presidents who agree with these new people to be part of the Métis Nation. So they're going to a pan-Aboriginal direction. There's no doubt about it. And MMF will never be part of a pan-Aboriginal organization. And at the end of the day, they're Congress of Aboriginal People 2.0. That's what they are. They're a Congress of Aboriginal People. That's what I'll be battling with in the future of representing dues off reserve. So again, it's quite a change of the direction of our nation. And I'm sure Riel is probably rolling in his grave thinking, how can this be after we gained so much ground in this country for us to go and allow ourselves to be sold and identity to have to happen right in front of us?
Is this kind of a watershed moment then in Métis politics? Does that mean the Métis National Council could be finished as we once knew it?
Well, to us, the MMF will never allow the Métis National Council to ever speak for us again. They've watered down the definition. They've taken away everything we believe in, everything we stand for, everything we've defended. MMF has always been the wall defending the invasion of the East to come in and steal who we are and our identity. We've always protected that. And to find that these other presidents have agreed to allow Ontario, to allow those people to come in, and everybody knows, and there's simplicity in this, Brett. All you have to ask them, look at Ottawa or Killarney or Simcoe out of Toronto, ask them, do they have any connection to the Red River Jig? Do they have any connection to the Red River Cart? Any connection to the Métis national flag? We flew here in 1816, our first battle. Our beadwork that we wear it proudly today, only found in the prairies. Any of these things, if you keep on going, the Michif language, none of it can be connected to them. So they know it. So they're just coming in, and now they're trying to do some beadwork. They're trying to do some kind of Red River Jig on their own now, and they're trying to steal our identity and our culture. And in other parts of the world, they go to war for this. So it's very clear from our perspective, MNC will no longer be what it is. And I think MNC is on its way to a different chapter. And as I said, it'll be Congress of Aboriginal People 2.0. It's going to find itself, how does it defend himself? And unfortunately, the advocate that they've selected is going to have a hell of a challenge to go and say she represents the Métis Nation, when the Métis Nation now is clearly a diluted people based on the definitions they're starting to use in their process. So it's unfortunate. I believed in the Métis National Council. I fought so hard for it. I negotiated some of the biggest funds in history on behalf of the Métis National Council for us to benefit here in Western Canada. And it really, I think, hurts many people. But Brett, this is important. Thousands of people are applying right now, Red River Métis from across Western Canada. And remember, our July 6th agreement, Brett, is that we represent the Red River Métis no matter where they live. There's no more provincial Manitoba boundary. We could represent them in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Vancouver, anywhere in the world, and we can represent them. That's what the agreement states with Canada, and we're moving it to our modern day treaty, which we anticipate we should have done within 6 months. So we're way ahead of everybody. We're the only self-government agreement in this country. The other 3 provinces claim to have it, but it's not a self-government agreement. All it takes is somebody to pick it up to read it, and you'll see they only assert they have self-government. Canada does not recognize they have self-government.
Okay, President Chartrand, there's a lot more to discuss on this issue, but unfortunately we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you for being on Nation to Nation tonight.
Thank you very much, Brett, for having me on the show.
Thank you. That wraps up our first show this season, and my first show as your new host. For much more, and to download our podcast, head to aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forster. Have a great evening.